Well, it's absolutely right. And just as Poppy mentioned, it's all about bad news for North American free trade and this region, in particular, Mexican steel and aluminum products. 90% of everything that Mexico produces in this country is exported to the United States. So it's going to make those metals and those products much more difficult to compete in the international market within the United States. And that's going to impact, of course, the industry here. And of course, just as Canada and China have both imposed retaliatory tariffs, Mexico has yet to do so. It's been able to dodge the first two sets of tariffs, achieving month-long extensions each time. But how long that can last now that these tariffs are coming into play, particularly on these metals, is another question entirely. And it's a question in which Mexico has some sort of play here. It has a strong hand, particularly because when it comes to steel and aluminum, the United States actually runs a very large trade surplus with Mexico. Much more American steel comes into Mexico than Mexico exports to the United States. Why? Because that raw steel is coming into Mexican manufacture operations. Mexico is taking that raw steel from the United States and it's making car parts, it's making automobiles, it's making machinery. So as if retaliatory tariffs are imposed, it's going to mean that 25% coming in, then 25% as it goes back to the United States. So 50% ultimately for the end consumer in the United States. But analysts in this industry who I've been speaking to in recent days about this issue have raised a very important point. And that is that if retaliatory tariffs are imposed on US metals coming into Mexico, that is going to make Mexico a much more competitive and attractive market for other countries who are also falling victim to these tariffs, particularly Canada, China and Brazil. Now that American steel in Mexico, given retaliatory tariffs, which are expected to be imposed by Mexico, now that American steel is more expensive in Mexico, that means that Brazilian steel, Canadian steel and Chinese steel, which are not subject to those tariffs, are much more competitive within this country's market. And what does that lead to? That thing which is going to be so important in this ongoing trade war, trade diversification. How much can you limit your exposure to dependence on the American market? So that's something very interesting, which may happen certainly in the long term, but as Poppy rightly mentions, in the short to medium term, it's going to mean trade supply chain disruption, value chain disruption, and as we've said throughout this, higher costs for the end consumer.